If you've paid attention to any of the new car releases, you've probably heard the term software defined vehicle. And what that is vehicles that their mechanical engineering is overshadowed by the software and technology that's packed inside. And in this James the Bike Guy video, I'm going to be showing you a bike that Specialized calls one bike to rule them all. But personally, I think it might just be the first of what we could consider a shock defined bicycle. And to begin that discussion, I want to introduce you to the new 2025 Specialized Stumpjumper Comp Alloy 15. It's a mouthful, but this is the newest generation, the 15th generation of the Specialized Stumpjumper, and it's now their alloy frame. When this first initially launched, I put up a video of the brand new carbon fiber variant of this bike, but believe it or not, well, they didn't launch with an alloy version of the bike, and I found that a bit strange considering Comp Alloy Stumpjumper was in the top 3 top-selling full suspension mountain bikes of the last couple of years. Now, no surprise they took their time to come out with the new version and dial it in, and it comes after the fanfare of the ultra lightweight and ultra expensive carbon fiber variant. But this alloy Stumpjumper at least proposes to be the one bike to rule them all and replace the other options that you need. Now, a couple of quick hits before we talk about just whether or not I believe that's the case. This is utilizing their M5 aluminum frame, which means it's shaped and butted tubings. So there's thick and thin spots throughout this as needed. You can see the hydroforming of the different shapes all across the bike. And it does feature new things like adding our internal frame storage down there for an alloy bike. They did have that on the carbon versions, but nice to see it here on the aluminum bike. Has the new Genie technology in the rear shock we'll touch on later, and it comes back to the FSR suspension design that left in the prior generation. They've also increased travel compared to the standard Stumpjumper with 150 millimeters of front suspension and 145 millimeters of rear FSR suspension. Now that's up from the standard Stumpjumper, but in the prior gen, they also had a Stumpjumper Evo, which this comes in just below, with the Evo having had 160 millimeters instead of the 150 up front. The other thing that is dialed into this bike is while they're all for the 29er in the front and the rear, this bike is mullet capable, so you could run a 27.5 in the rear, and in fact, the smallest frame size does that too. But why do I think it's kind of funny that this is one bike to rule them all? Well, there's a couple of things. The first piece would be Specialized has certainly split the difference between the Evo and the standard Stumpjumper of the prior generation, but they've also launched 2 new bikes for this year. They've added the Chisel, which comes in as a slightly sportier version of what the old Stumpjumper was, and they've added a Status 140, or rather I should say refresh the Status 140, that comes in both at a lower price point and slightly less travel than what we have on this bike. So for one bike to rule them all, they've added to the lineup. Now, I think part of why they say that's the case is with this new 150 millimeter front shock, which on the comp version here is the Fox 36 Rhythm. This is now giving lots of suspension travel up front. You've got a ton of adjustment of this bike, almost like the old Evo, with the headset cup, which is an angle set, essentially allows you to make it 1 degree slacker or 1 degree steeper out of the stock setup. And then out back, they're adding in yet some more suspension updates, just like the Evo before, with a adjustment for high and low position on the horse link. And the horse link back here means that this is a 4-bar suspension setup. Specialized calls it FSR, 4-bar, whatever you want to call it. It means that you've got a pivot right at above where the bottom bracket is. Out back, you've got this pivot, which is before the rear axle and kind of the magic of a 4-bar horse link design. Then you've got your next bar comes up, and that connects everything together. So those 4 bars that you have involved, 1, 2, 3, and 4 there, allow for a lot of suspension tuning that they can do. And it's also one of the few suspension designs that's truly independent from where the pedals are. Basically, by having that pivot just before the rear axle, it allows them to have a lot more control over bump compliance, but often at the disadvantage of making the bike feel a little bit too soft and disconnected, especially during explosive power. And that's kind of what I'm calling a shock defined mountain bike. Now, and that's because the new bike is rocking a specific shock from Fox that was built in collaboration with it that they're calling the Genie. And basically, what the Genie shock does is it gives additional support and a more refined way of being able to control this 4-bar linkage than what we've seen on prior generation bikes. And a couple of numbers pulled straight from Specialized marketing material is that they claim that this is going to have about 57% more traction than a bike that was running a standard air shock. They also claim that the way that this is going to be able to control bump impacts is more similar to what you'd have on a Specialized Enduro, a longer travel bike, meaning that it should be much more plush, have lots more traction, and should run through about the same travel as the 170 millimeter Specialized Enduro when subjected to about 1,080 Newton meter force. What all that really means is, well, in the beginning of the suspension travel, the way the Genie works is it's got a pretty unique chambering system that allows the shock to have a very linear, almost coil spring like response through the first 70% of the travel. And in the remaining portion of the travel, it has a rising rate. That means the bike should resist bottom out considerably compared to traditional shock, and Specialized claims it's about 39% less likely to bottom out. But it also means that you have tons of adjustment you can do in there. And in fact, with the Genie shock on this bike, it comes with a whole tuning kit of several spacers to be able to adjust when and where you're starting to get that rising rate and where the bike's feeling plush. And so much so that there's an app and a whole bunch of reading you're going to have to do to get it dialed in. And that's where I think this bike is really defined by its shock. Because if you were to pull this off and it is capable of running just a traditional air shock or even converting the bike to the coil, you'll kind of take away some of the magic that they've baked into the new frame and potentially bring it back to, well, maybe the Evo version of last year. Because after all, the geometry, while still quite modern, comes in with a head angle of 64.5 degrees on a size S4, a seat tube angle of 76.5 degrees, a chainstay length of 435 millimeters, which I should mention ranges between 430 and 445, depending on your bike size, and a reach in an S4 of 475 millimeters. So it's decidedly modern, but hardly a huge departure from the bike we had prior. And considering the standard Stumpjumper in prior generation used a flex stay, which they've brought over to the Specialized Chisel, more XC or trail bike oriented version. And the Evo ran FSR 4-bar linkage with the same adjustability in the back and in the head tube, makes me believe that this is really an evolvement of the prior generation Evo with slightly less travel and a whole heck of a lot better shock technology. Well, this being a comp model is $4,500, and for that, you're going to get the TRP Trail Evo brakes, which are a 4-piston caliper on the front and the rear, as well as nicely you have a SLX drivetrain, so full 12-speed SLX drivetrain. Awesome to see with that 10 to 51 tooth rear cassette, tons of range, and a super reliable drivetrain. You've got a threaded bottom bracket, fully internal cable routing throughout the bike. Of course, that frame storage, a X-Fusion Manic dropper post on the back, always good to see, and an alloy cockpit with aluminum wheels and these Specialized Butcher tires on the front and Eliminator tire on the rear. As I mentioned before, you can set it up with a mixed wheel size running a 27.5-inch rear wheel and tire. Granted, you'll need to adjust the geometry to make sure you don't have pedal strikes, considering just how low this bike's bottom bracket drop is. Well, now that we've taken a look at the features and designs, it's time we find out what it weighs. And the actual weight of this Stumpjumper alloy comp in a size S4 comes in and weighs 35.44 pounds. Thanks for joining me to check out the 2025 Specialized Stumpjumper Comp Alloy 15. Go ahead and let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. Where do you think this ranks in, and think that it might just be the first shock-defined mountain bike?